Welcome to Inside Independent Publishing with IBPA. I'm your host, Christopher Locke. I'm also the IBPA Director of Membership and Member Services. Now, one quick note before we get to the interview. IBPA is very grateful for everyone who is listening to this podcast. So we want to give a $20 discount to members. This is new and recurring members. If you renew and or add your membership between now and August 31st, 2024, use promo code podcast AUG20, the number 20, podcast AUG20, the P and the A are capitalized. During checkout, we will give you $20 off. Okay, so today's episode is very exciting. I'm excited to talk to our guest. Let's start with this. Book selling profit margins can be quite tight for independent publishers, but with some ingenuity, publishers can create additional revenue streams. Agate Publishing President Doug Seibold has had great success with his publishing company, as well as various endeavors related to publishing. So he joins the podcast today to discuss his publishing online education program, package trade publishing, his new venture, Agate Publishing Academy, and much more. Hello, Doug. How are you?
Hi, Christopher. I'm good. Thanks.
All right. So we've got a lot to discuss today, but I do want to start by just asking you about Agate Publishing. So can we set the stage? How long has Agate Publishing been in business, and then what types of books do you all generally publish?
Well, this fall, it'll be 22 years since I incorporated the company. We published our first book in May of 2003. That book was from what became our Bolden line, which is devoted entirely to fiction and nonfiction solely by Black American writers. We also have an imprint called B2 Books, which does books about business with a particular focus on management and workplace experience. In 2006, I bought another company called Surrey Books, which we continued as an imprint of Agate, which is devoted to books about food, dining, health, and nutrition. And then in 2012, I started an imprint called Midway Books, which is devoted to Midwestern topics and authors.
Wow. Okay. So you run the whole gamut. That's really great. So what's awesome about that is that when we talk, there's so much people can learn from you. You've clearly been doing so much, and acquiring other businesses is also a whole other endeavor. So as an indie publisher, you have been successful, but you've also had these additional revenue streams that you and I have talked about. Let's start with the online education program. So how did you come up with the idea to create that program?
Sure. Well, immediately before starting Agate, I had been working at an online education.com startup based in the Chicago northern suburbs. Agate is based in Evanston, just north of the Chicago city line. I had been doing a range of other things in my career before then. I'd started out as an editor and a freelance writer, and that's kind of my background. I'm more of an autodidact in terms of business know-how and things like that. I spent about 4 years at that online ed startup, and it really gave me a lot of exposure to what was involved in producing effective learning content, especially in online formats, but just generally for the sake of adult learners in particular. After all the air came out of that company, and a few years after I started Agate, a bunch of my former colleagues started reaching out to me because they remembered me as the publishing guy at this company and the person who, had a particular publishing-oriented perspective on content. And they were interested in learning more or looking for help from me about creating content at their organizations, most of which were learning related in one way or another. And a couple of those apples fell on my head, and I eventually realized that this might comprise a business opportunity for Agate. So beginning around 2006, I started what we now call Agate Development as a way for us to sort of deploy kind of similar publishing related skills, but to do it in a way where we were basically providing contract services to much bigger organizations. It's not unlike what the packaging industry is in trade publishing. In the textbook world, they call it development. And basically what they do is they outsource a lot of the work involved in creating learning content, whether it's stuff from textbooks. We started out specifically doing online courses, Now we do like high stakes assessments of all kinds, pretty much everything from reading and math support for kids as young as 4 years old up to continuing professional ed for people in fields like finance and medicine. It's a lot of the same stuff that publishers do, but just deployed in sort of a different business context.
Well, how are these classes set up? So they're online, but like, what's the format? Like, what, where are they online? And then, like, is it like already pre-recorded, or these live?
Well, the stuff that we create for our clients is theirs to own. We're a service provider in those businesses. So some of our clients are online schools. Some of them are, traditional universities. Some of them are large textbook companies. Some of them are corporations or trade associations. So they really own the relationship with the student or the reader or the end user. And what we do is really just work with them behind the scenes on developing the content.
And who reaches out to whom? Like, how do people know that you, like, especially when you're starting out, that you even do this?
Christopher, a lot of it was really through personal contacts in the very beginning. It started with people that I used to work with reaching out to me, for my help as a consultant, or even as just somebody who would talk to them on the phone about what their needs were. So we started there really through folks that I had formerly been working with. And as we had some success with that, they referred us to other people that they knew. I knew a few folks in the textbook industry here in Chicago, so I started reaching out to them and saying, hey, this is something that Agate is doing now. And fortunately, because we were doing a good job for our clients, they began to offer us more and different kinds of work. And we also saw that as we were flourishing this way, if some of our clients moved on to new organizations, they oftentimes wanted to hire us at the new places where they'd started. And it just kind of built up that way. And eventually we began to develop, sort of a marketing arm for it so we could reach out to, a broader range of organizations. But I can't underestimate the value of, both having that initial personal network, which was really just a product of, my colleagues, my former colleagues at places where I'd worked. And then the product of doing good work for these organizations and people feeling like they wanted to support us by giving us more work.
Yeah. What's interesting about, so like with books, you can, the cost of a book is pretty clear. You're like, okay, it costs this much to print and all the other things involved. So then you go, well, that's going to be $30, right? So I'm interested with this type of, business endeavor. How do you even begin to go, okay, well, this should be $500 or something? Like,
right.
How did you figure out the cost that you would charge people?
Well, we do that oftentimes based on our judgment and our experience in terms of the work effort that's involved in a project. I would say, though, that it's considerably less speculative and kind of less hard to calculate than traditional book publishing is. You might have a sense of, what goes into the costs of producing a book, and you can put a price on it, as you suggested. But what you don't know is how many copies of that book you're going to sell. Could be 300, could be 3,000, could be 300,000, could be 3 million. You don't know, and you're basically making a speculative decision with each book that you publish, albeit one that's informed by ideally by your experience as a publisher, to give you a sense of, what you think the market demand for something might be. But if we knew what was going to be a bestseller, we would just keep publishing bestsellers. It would be a lot simpler. For our Agate development business, what we know is sort of how many hours might go into performing a certain amount of work that we're being commissioned to do. So we can sort of make estimations of what our costs are going to be when we bid on a project. And in doing so, can really give ourselves a pretty clear-cut sense of what we think our costs are going to be and what we think our margin might be based on the bid and what we're asking to be paid. And a lot of what we do is oftentimes spec'd out in great detail before we actually commit to a bid. So when we say that we're going to do a project for somebody, we provide elaborate detail about what exactly that work effort is going to comprise. And, that specification becomes part of our contract with our client. So we don't get into sort of unexpected dimensions of their asking us to do new or different things, or potentially getting into a situation where we have to solicit work from somebody on a project and we don't know what the cost of that work is going to be. We do a lot of that estimating in advance of bidding on a project and signing a contract for it. And then once we sign a contract, we have a pretty good sense not only of what our costs are, because we've already estimated those out, but also of what our revenue is going to be. It's fixed according to the terms of that contract. So as a result, it's a lot more predictable, actually, than the trade publishing side of our business.
Okay. Well, in terms of also then the content, so do you have specific subjects that you all focus on? I mean, because it can be pretty broad if you have universities and schools, like they do tons of different types of things. So
Right.
Do you have maybe like a set group of things where you're like, these are the types of courses we can create? Or does someone come to you and you go, all right, and then you just kind of figure it out from there? Maybe we can do this.
Yeah, it's more the latter. I think partly that's just a product of the depth of experience we have at this point. We started out doing online courses, but we've now expanded into, textbooks, assessments, and all manner of other kinds of learning materials. I think we started out with a predisposition toward, college level general education type stuff, base level courses for online universities. But now I think we're confident pretty much doing anything. And in part, that's because one of the core competencies we have in this business is finding the kinds of subject matter experts that we know can do a good job for any kind of material for whatever a client might need from us. I mean, that could be jet engine maintenance. It could be basic gen ed stuff like, psychology or introduction to business or English literature. It could be stuff, as I said, in, all manner of different fields in finance and medicine, which can get pretty specialized. But again, a key part of that is being able to find the folks who've got the domain expertise that you need, and sort of deploy them on projects. And understanding not only which of those folks have that expertise, but also which have the kind of aptitude for creating content that you need. Are they good writers? Are they fast writers? Are they collaborative? These are some of the key things that we look for. And we have a network, I would say, probably of several hundred freelancers and contractors who work with us on these projects, who might be writers, editors, instructional designers, graphic designers, videographers, as well as folks who have dedicated content knowledge in different fields where we might be working on a project. About a dozen years ago, we did a project for a vet tech program. So we found a terrific veterinary authority, actually here in the Chicago area, and he did a great job on this project. We haven't had call for his particular set of skills since that time, but it's our ability to find people and recognize their aptitudes. That's a key part of what we do with that.
Interesting. And you mentioned packaging, trade publishing. So can you tell us like what is that? How do you get into that? And then I guess it's very closely related to all this other stuff you were talking about.
Yeah, packaging is a business that's been around time for a long time in trade publishing, and that's where a larger publisher will essentially turn to a smaller organization to pretty much develop a book to a finished state and then sort of turn it over on a contract basis to that bigger publisher. Sometimes packagers will develop book ideas on their own and then pitch them to larger publishers. And sometimes larger publishers will reach out to packagers that they know that say, hey, we're interested in a project like this. Are you interested in producing it for us? And so it's contract work. And oftentimes, it's outsourced work where you're working with what's usually a much bigger organization. It requires, packagers to really understand everything that goes into producing a book. Sometimes packagers will just turn over print-ready files or even just finished manuscripts, to their larger client. Some packagers deliver actual finished printed books to a publisher's warehouse. So
Oh,
it runs the gamut that way. And this business has been around a good 50 plus years, or even longer if you think about things like the Stratmeyer syndicate that produced things like the Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys books, back like 90 years ago.
And is it part of it where there's some type of lump sum, or do you all, like as the smaller publisher, get royalties from the books, for years to come?
It's usually a lump sum,
Mm.
and that's what sort of distinguishes it from more of a traditional relationship to that bigger publisher.
Mm. Well,
But, basically, anything goes in terms of people determining, what sort of business relationship they want to try to pursue. But really the distinction between packaging and a conventional author role would really be in that being contract work instead of it being like a license project, like a traditional trade book.
well, what's interesting is that a lot of times we think of like the bigger publishers as separate, and then smaller publishers as, like just a whole different group. But the more I'm in this industry, there is a lot of overlap where they work together more than people think, from the outside. Is that like, did you have relationships then with some of these bigger publishers who have reached out to you to do this type of stuff? Because I imagine then some of the smaller publishers now are like, well, I'd like to do that, but they don't know how to even start.
Yeah. Well, on the Agate development side, we had the relationships with a few folks at large textbook companies. But just to be clear, Agate doesn't do packaging here. Although our Agate development group is the work that we do is packaging like, but more for the educational publishing world. But I think a lot of people who work in packaging are people who previously worked at bigger firms. And then they essentially said, I'm going to go out on my own and do my own thing. But I think, Christopher, one of the things for companies like Agate, which is to say like a smaller traditional publisher, where you've got a lot of interaction with the bigger presses, might be when you're selling rights. So 20 years ago, Agate was fortunate enough that when we brought out our first book, there was a lot of interest from bigger presses about acquiring the paperback rights.
Mm.
And we ended up selling the rights for mass market paperback for our very first book.
Mm.
And I actually developed a relationship with an editor who was involved in that, who is somebody I'm still friends with now, who has a very high level executive position at Harper.
Mm.
And somebody I've stayed in touch with, these past 20 years. But there's oftentimes a lot of interaction in that marketplace, in the sub-rights marketplace or in the rights marketplace. We've had some authors who've gone on to have, big careers at larger publishers. And then they've come back to us and asked if they could buy out the rights to the books that Agate published so they could consolidate their backlist at the bigger press where they're being published now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of things go on like that. Some of the bigger publishers control, like, say, audiobook operations, and they might bid to buy the audiobook rights. But I think that that's always been a part of the publishing ecosystem, are these exchanges regarding different kinds of rights licenses. And so that's something that I think is pretty common for a lot of publishers Agate's size. And of course, the biggest part of that usually is translation, where if a book is successful, you'll see a lot of interest from other countries about, publishing a translation of that book in their language.
So you mentioned backlist, and this is a conversation you and I had previously. You told me that a backlist revenue stream is really, really important for publishers in terms of long-term success. So I wanted to see if you could quickly define what backlist and frontlist means, but then explain how does a publisher go about strengthening their backlist?
Sure. Well, backlist is really any book that is more than a year or so old. A book that you published, more than a year or so ago. that is continuing to sell in steady numbers. Front list are the new books that you release, where you'll get advance orders from retailers, and then you'll fulfill those advance orders. And ideally, a front list book, if it continues to find a readership over a longer period of time, just by sort of enduring for that year or more, becomes reclassified as a backlist book. And for most successful publishing companies of any size, you have a steady stream of revenue that comes from the ongoing sale of backlist titles. It's the durable interest that readers have in books that were published years ago. And obviously, if you look at the big conglomerate publishers, a huge part of their revenue comes from books that have been published not just a year ago, but a decade, or in some cases, even a century ago. In the case of some of these sort of great 20th century books that a lot of us read in school, which provide, a huge and fairly consistent stream of revenue for, these bigger publishers. A great example of this that people point to over and over again is the work of Dr. Seuss. That those are books that came out over decades that still sell in perennially high numbers. Again, a lot of the fiction that people read in middle school and high school, a book like To Kill a Mockingbird came out, I guess, around 60 years ago now, and it still sells, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of copies every year. So for a new company, it can be very challenging to reach the point where you have enough books in print and those books have been successful enough that you have a steady stream of that backlist revenue. And what it means is that the initial challenge of a publishing startup comes in having to keep making those investments in releasing those front list books while you don't have any of that steady and consistent revenue from backlist books. Whereas once you reach that point where you do have some steady and consistent revenue from backlist, it really simplifies a lot of your business operations and makes it a lot easier to manage the ongoing publication of the new front list titles. And the way that you kind of strengthen and replenish backlist is by finding new books that are going to keep selling in that steady and consistent number. And again, just as with bestsellers, we don't always know what those books are going to be. And if we did, we would just sort of publish them in a more predictable way. A lot of this is trial and error. A lot of this is, making your best estimate of where you think, a long-term audience for a book might come from, and then trying to publish into that sort of market demand as best you can.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult for something like you said, To Kill a Mockingbird or something, to know if that's going to be a classic. But I mean, are there any types of books that might lend themselves to being maybe a safer bet, if you will, that might be something that would sell well annually?
Well, one of the things that we found at Agate is that our food and cooking related titles tend to have sort of a steadier long-term sales profile, I would say. And I'll contrast that with like narrative books, like fiction and memoir. Narrative books, I think, if they become successful, tend to have a greater likelihood of seeing more subsidiary rights opportunities. You're more likely to get an offer to publish an audiobook. You're more likely to get offers for translation rights. You don't have those kind of things necessarily with a cookbook. There's not as much of a market for translation for cookbooks because most publishers, in countries around the world already have kind of a good fix on what their local markets or their local audiences want in a cookbook. They don't tend to translate or transfer quite as well as fiction might. But the issue with fiction is that there's a lot of it every year, and a lot of books just don't find a significant enough audience to kind of engender that sort of subsidiary rights interest. So it's a little bit more of a high risk, high reward publishing model. Again, if one of those books hits, you get all these different revenue streams from those sub-rights licenses. Whereas the cookbooks tend to be something that may be sort of slower and steadier and more focused on your, particular local or domestic market in terms of, sort of reaching out to and appealing to like a consistent number of people year after year. This is kind of a broad I would say, generalization.
Mhm.
You know, I can't say that, you can be guaranteed that this would be the case with any books that you publish in these kinds of topic areas, but it's what we found here at Agate. And it's helped us kind of diversify the range of things we publish in ways where we've got things that are more high risk and high reward, and we've got things that tend, on the average, to maybe have a bit more of a predictable sales pattern and longer term sales pattern.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, along those lines, in terms of like, the running the business, something I think you have a lot of expertise on is that whole concept of, so like, for example, when you were first starting out, I know there are a lot of publishers out there, like it's just them and it's overwhelming because they're wearing all the hats.
Yeah.
So I was interested, like who the first employee that you hired was, and why you decided to say,
Yeah.
oh, that's the person I need to really help me first.
Right. Well, I think it was really, it really is, you're wearing all the hats in the very beginning. And I think in a lot of ways, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because one of the aspects of that is that you get a feel for all of the different ways your new company is functioning. You sort of see what's happening in a way that helps educate you and gives you more perspective, especially like me, if you're somebody who comes from one particular aspect of publishing, which in my case was sort of editorial and writing. Um, and I found it really, really useful to get that perspective from being not just the person acquiring and editing books, but also the person doing promotion and marketing, the person doing production, and the person kind of running the financial operation of the business. I think the thing that I figured out relatively quickly is that I needed help with some of that financial operational stuff. And the first person that I hired at Agate is somebody who had a particular area of expertise with bookkeeping. That's something that I think any business owner needs to understand. They need to have a good fix on accounting and bookkeeping, what it is, how it works, why it works the way that it does. But it is demanding and time consuming to actually perform bookkeeping. I felt comfortable with all the other aspects of what I was doing. I could handle the production work, the editorial work, the sales and marketing work just fine. But in terms of the total volume of work, where I needed help first was, I think, in that kind of like financial infrastructure area. And what I've counseled other publishers on with this is, take a look at where you feel like you need the most help. It could be editorial work. It could be promotional PR work. If you can manage a lot of the other aspects of what's going on with your business, then I think it makes sense to, as you grow, seek out people in the areas where you feel you personally have the most need for support. Here's another example. I had a terrific relationship with an organization that did book production and typesetting, and so it was easy for me to continue deploying that organization as Agate grew. Same with a designer, a cover designer. I felt like it didn't make sense for me to look for an in-house designer until Agate reached a certain size. That was actually one of the last roles that I filled internally, because I had a small company and there just wasn't enough work to do for somebody doing design work for us until we reached a certain size.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think a lot of people who start a company are turning to different kinds of contractors or service providers to help them do these kind of things. And your job is to sort of manage and oversee all of those different parties. But as far as bringing somebody in internally, that was the decision that I made. And that's why I made it the way that I did.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I know for me, anything that's involving math, I'm like, oh, I'm going to hire someone to do that. There's division.
Yeah. Well, it was less the math than it's a lot of very detailed data entry. You need to understand sort of what's going on with that, but there's great tools out there, spreadsheets and things like that make all of this easier. But you need somebody who's got a fix on that stuff, but also, a facility with those software tools and, the ability to kind of execute on it efficiently.
Yeah, and you have to pay your authors royalties, and that can be kind of complicated. And you want someone who's focused on making sure they're doing stuff like that.
Yep.
Talking about money, I know you and I also talked about building a line of credit with your bank, and you were telling me that it's so important to foster a relationship with your bank. So I'm wondering, can you talk about that, and how do you even
Sure.
do that?
Well, I didn't have any experience running a business when I started Agate. I had tried to interest people in investing in the company, and although, I had some really warm exchanges with people over a matter of years, never really got to the point where I had the resources that were necessary, I felt, to get things started. I realized I was going to have to do it on my own. I used, pretty much all of our personal savings, my household's personal savings, in order to do it.
Hmm.
But I also felt like, credit was going to be important to this. It would be the sole place that I could turn if I needed more money to sort of help kind of keep the operations of the company fluid. So I actually had the idea before I started Agate, before I launched the business, of going around and interviewing different bankers here in my community and just saying, look, I'm starting a company. This is what I'm going to be doing. I'm looking for a bank to, kind of handle our savings and checking accounts. And I'm not going to ask you for money now,
Hmm.
but what I'm going to do probably is come and ask you for a line of credit down the road. And I want you to see what I'm doing. I want you to see what it is that I'm aspiring to do with this company. And I want you to see what happens as I achieve those things. What I was trying to do, Christopher, was kind of create a situation where I could get them to see my confidence in what I was doing. And then also, get into a situation where a banker might evaluate me on my ability to kind of hit a target
Hmm.
that I would define for them and say, like, okay, within a year, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and we're going to make this much money,
Hmm.
and we're going to have published this many books. And, my hope is that you will have seen me accomplish this and will see me as a good credit risk and as somebody who is, willing to, be a lender, from your bank. And I met a banker that I thought really had a feel for what we were doing. He was really interested in my business. We had some extensive conversations, and it worked out exactly as I could hope.
Hmm.
We ended up getting into a line of credit relationship with this bank, in less than a year
Hmm.
after I published our first book.
Hmm.
Probably, I would say it was maybe around a year after I incorporated. And when I started the interview process of going around, I talked to around 5 different banks, I want to say, in my community here. And I think that my taking this approach ended up impressing the banker. And when I did have some early initial success, it made him very confident that I knew what I was doing, which is, part of what bankers do, is try to evaluate, who might be a good risk for them in terms of, creating loans or a line of credit
Hmm.
along the way.
I love that approach. It's things like that when it comes to business that they don't really necessarily tell you in school or whatever. And I'm just glad you figured that out, that you're like, hey, I'm going to try this, and that it worked out. So I hope other people can
Yeah.
learn from that.
Yeah. As it
So
turned out, Christopher, I had a lot of experience with debt. Uh, I paid my way through college. I
yeah.
borrowed an enormous amount of money in student loans, probably the equivalent, this was 40 years ago, but this is probably the equivalent to about $90,000 in 2024 money. And
Mm.
it took me a solid decade or so after graduating in order to, pay all that off and retire that debt. I got very used to being thrifty. I got very used to sort of the discipline and the constraint that, owing that kind of money, imposed on me.
Mm.
My life might have been very different if I hadn't been dealing with that sort of debt, at that age. Um, but I was very gratified, that I was able to pay it off when I did. And I think it put me in a position where when I started Agate, I kind of had a background and understanding of that kind of circumstance, of borrowing money and owing money so that I could accomplish something that I thought was important and worthwhile. And then functioning in a way where like repaying that money was just baked into what it was that I was doing. I was comfortable with that in part because of that personal experience.
Yeah. Well, being in debt can teach you a lot of interesting lessons, and
Yeah.
is like, how do I eat food on like, $6 a week? So I definitely want to make sure we talk about Agate Publishing Academy.
Right.
What's great about someone like you is that, you've been in the business a while, but you're happy to share advice and to mentor people. So you created Agate Publishing Academy. Can you tell us what is that, and
Sure.
how people can get involved?
It arose out of a couple of different things, Christopher. One was that we've had a training program for the interns we have here at Agate over the past 20 years. We've trained about 130 interns over that
Wow.
period of time, and we ended up developing a pretty robust training program for them. I think the other thing was that we had this whole other business that was involved in creating online courses and learning resources and textbooks and learning material. And I'd never really thought to sort of bring that to bear on publishing. That was a private label business. It was a service we provided to other companies. I never really thought about it as something where I could, create training and learning for the publishing industry. It took a while for that idea to occur to me. Um, but I think the other thing was that I had to kind of make my own way in terms of learning and figuring this business out in a way that took years and was not really something that involved a lot of clarity or perspective about the opportunities that might be available to me. I mean, I think Chicago is notable, as a very, very big city that has a very, very small publishing community.
Mm.
So there weren't a lot of jobs. There weren't a lot of models, here in Chicago for me. I knew that this was something that I wanted to do and was interested in doing. I went to work for a small press in Chicago in the early 90s that ultimately failed a few years later.
Mm.
And most of what I learned there were, object lessons and what not to do, cautionary lessons.
Mm.
I didn't really have a lot in the way of mentors or guidelines. And I didn't really have the money, to kind of go and participate in like a publishing institute or, that sort of thing, which was really costly and, would have entailed my kind of dropping everything else in the middle of my life so I could go and pursue something like that.
Mm.
I took a DIY approach. And because I spent 7 years trying to get Agate started, I had a lot of time where I was kind of learning about business, learning about different aspects of the publishing industry, figuring out like kind of a business model, and doing that, at night after I had my day job, because I was really passionate about trying to get my company started. And I kind of wish in retrospect, Christopher, it didn't have to be so hard, and I think one of the things that I'm interested in doing at this stage of my career is trying to figure out ways to create opportunities for people to learn about publishing that are more focused, more affordable, and more accessible than the alternatives that are out there right now. And I'm hoping it can create more opportunity like the people that I've been training as interns here over the past 20 years, but do it on a bigger scale, for people who are looking for that first job in publishing.
Mm.
I'm hoping I can give people a broader perspective on how publishing works than even a lot of people working in really big companies are able to get, because they're stuck inside their own sort of disciplinary silo. Like editors learn about editing, publicists learn about publicity, but they don't necessarily learn about everything that connects the 360 degrees of a publishing operation. And lastly, I want to help other people learn how to start a company the way that I did
Mm.
20 years ago. I learned a lot along the way, and my interest at this stage in my career is getting more information out of this dome and in a form that's available to other people that, again, is focused, affordable, and accessible.
Mm-hmm. And are they online courses? Like, is it, whatever, 7 courses? Like by the way, it's agatepublishingacademy.com, AGATE, agatepublishingacademy.com. But when people go there, what are they signing up for?
Well, right now we have 4 courses live. By the end of this year, we expect we'll have 8 courses. And by the end of 2025, we expect we'll have 15.
Mm.
So they're going to be a blend of 2 different sorts of courses. The larger courses are actually hybrid online and live video conference models. So our flagship entry-level course is called Publishing Basics, and it comprises 8 online modules, each of which is followed by a live video conference discussion seminar. So that course runs for 8 weeks. But we also have 3 smaller courses available now that are effectively just online modules. Mm. So those are much smaller and lighter weight, and those are for people that want to dip in a very affordable way and get exposure to a particular topic. And we expect that as the program continues to grow, we're going to have these larger course offerings and these briefer offerings in sort of a mixture.
Well, one thing I really like that I know we had talked about in the past is, like you were mentioning, it's very expensive going to one of these publishing programs at one of these universities, and those programs are great, but there are people who just can't afford them. And also, it's not just the school, it's like then they'd have to go to New York City or something, and that's expensive. So I love that you're helping people who can't normally access the publishing industry access this information. And some cool breaking news for the podcast listeners. Doug is working with us on trying to offer a benefit for the IBPA members to be able to attend Agate Publishing Academy. So more details will come on that later, but we're grateful for you for doing that, because our members, some of them are just starting out, but they also have, if they're established, they have employees who might be just starting out, who, they'd love to take the courses. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key things about my whole approach to this, Christopher, is taking an independent publisher approach, in part because independent publishers typically need to have a fuller understanding of how publishing works. That's sort of baked into what it requires to have a successful small publishing operation. You have to understand every aspect of how that company functions. The other is that independent publishing is spread out across the country in a way that conglomerate publishing isn't. That's heavily concentrated in New York and on the East Coast. Mm. Independent publishing is its own national network. And I feel like there are a lot of folks across the country that are interested in publishing that, for the reasons that you described, are kind of denied opportunity to kind of learn more, or to get an opportunity to get exposure to what publishing is about. Mm. And trying to activate the network of independent publishers is a big part of what we're trying to do. We definitely are presenting our program to the world as something that is coming from the community of independent publishers. Mm-hmm. This is something that we're trying to characterize to people as kind of not really opposed to master's programs, but as what we see as sort of, again, this more practical alternative, and something that is really coming from working professionals and not from sort of an academic context, which is why we think it can be so much more affordable and focused as well.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I remember I went to the film school, and when I got out, I was like, oh no, they just taught us a lot of theory, but like the stuff that we actually do, like in terms of editing and in terms of shooting a camera and all that, I was like, I don't know enough about how to do the practical, literal things I need to get hired for a job. So I totally can relate to that.
It's a big focus. You hit the nail on the head. That is a big focus of our approach. What do you actually do all day in one of these industry jobs? And how does it relate to the other jobs that people are performing?
Mm-hmm. This has been such amazing information. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about all this. You've been very successful, and I love that, from the beginning, you were not just thinking about running a publishing program, but then all these other aspects. I don't know how you do it because it's hard enough running a publishing program, but apparently you just don't sleep or something. But thank you so much. So I want everyone to check out Agate Publishing. It's agatepublishing.com. And then Agate Publishing Academy is agatepublishingacademy.com. Again, we're going to work on getting a member benefit sometime coming up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Doug, for all this information. So I want to also make sure people join IBPA. This is the type of information education that we provide. We have so many resources. Visit ibpa-online.org. And remember, podcast listeners, from now through the end of August 31st, if you join IBPA, you get a $20 discount with the podcast AUG20. Again, that's podcast AUG20. The P and the A are capitalized. The 20 is numbers. This whole thing we're doing right here, the podcast, every Thursday, last Thursday of every month, on YouTube. You can subscribe to it. Again, Doug, thank you so much. And we appreciate everyone for listening.
Thank you, Christopher.